have you this morning for our release of our climate security report. For those who were not familiar with ASP, we were founded in 2006, and the purpose behind it was to take topical issues from a national security perspective. And of course, climate change was foremost among those issues. And we've been studying that for 6 years plus now. And we put out several reports on it, not the least of which was Pay Now, Pay Later, which we put out last year with a big spread, thanks to Governor Christine Todd Whitman. And yesterday, we had a pre-release of our current report. We did a conference call with Christine. Of course, she's up at her home in New Jersey, former governor of New Jersey for 7 years. No power, trees down on her house. We honestly did not plan this around Sandy, but interesting that it was concurrent to our event. And we think here at ASP, certainly that climate change is a national security issue and it's not covered well enough. Now, I've been asked a lot of questions the last day or so about the campaigns and Obama and Romney and their plans for climate change and, frankly, the lack of mention of it in either campaign. And what I tell folks is what we do today with our release of report is not going to influence what happens on Tuesday, but it might influence what happens on Wednesday. Whoever gets elected, we're hoping will take this seriously and recognize it for the national security issue that it is. We were founded here at ASP with members from both parties. We are nonpartisan. We had equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and then we had about half a dozen flag officers from all the services. And I'm proud to say we have one of them sitting here this morning. It's General Daniel Christman, who's going to speak in a minute. Dan is former superintendent of West Point, combat veteran from Vietnam, a combat engineer, now a vice president at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The way I want to do this morning is turn it over to General Christman, and then following him, I'm going to turn it over to General Steve Anderson. Steve's a member of our Consensus for National Security, which was formed a couple of years ago around New START, which was a big success for ASP. He is the Chief Marketing Officer for Reliant LLC, which is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business based in Knoxville, Tennessee. He's more famous, perhaps, Steve, for his job working logistics for General Petraeus in Iraq for well over a year plus. He is also a West Point grad, but I'm proud to say he's also a graduate of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College.
Semper Fi.
That's right, Semper Fi. And last but not least, I'll turn it over to Andrew Holland, who is a co-author of the report. He's our senior fellow for energy and climate. I'm excited to say that we ran an article yesterday, which is co-written by Nick Cunningham, and Nick, is right here, which was run this morning in Stars and Stripes, and we're excited that it got into the early bird, of course. So there's been some considerable press about it, despite everything going on in New York and New Jersey, and certainly the campaign. With that, I'd like to turn it over to General Christman for your short remarks, sir, and then I'll turn it over to General Anderson and then Andrew.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. I'm honored to be flanked by two Steves and by Andrew. Wonderful job on this report. I think all of us here in this room would say we regret that the report happened to be so timely. I mean, just given the human costs here that are involved, you see this on the news channels, and it just tears your heart for these folks that are struggling here. But it does provide this opportunity to focus on a very, very timely issue, and that's climate change and the national security impacts. The report's wonderful. I congratulate ASP for that. Second, I just want to say how honored I have been to be associated with ASP since 2005. It's an organization which, in topics like this and with reports like this, I think really distinguishes itself amongst the many such advocacy groups and think tanks in town for looking well beyond the immediate issue and asking legitimate questions about long-term security issues. I want to focus the bulk of these brief remarks on the international arena, but as a Corps of Engineer officer who had responsibility for the Georgia coasts in the 1980s, I just have to say a few words about Sandy. I think, like most of us, we've had a chance to get on the subway line, the 1-2 line. We have a place in New York, Broadway at 66, and head down to Battery. And the South Ferry Station, I think most of us are familiar with. I went there a couple of weeks ago to grab a shuttle boat over to Ellis Island. And even then, at high tide, long before Sandy was even on the horizon, it was very clear how vulnerable that part of the city is. When I saw the efforts in the spin-up to Sandy, trying to put covers with 2x material, plywood, and sandbags over the entrance to the subways, my heart sank. As an engineer, we used to study the experiences in Europe in the great floods in the Netherlands in 1953. And that country made a decision in the early 50s to protect large cities against the 10,000-year event, and small cities the 4,000-year event. And just think of the neuralgia in this country that was expended to try to protect New Orleans for the 100-year event. And as one walks to Lower Manhattan and sees the vulnerability there, you have to wonder, to what year is that city protected? The 1 in 10-year event, the 1 in 5-year event, when other countries have made the decision long ago, looking at the dangers of inundation in the coastal lowlands like the Netherlands, to protect to the 10,000-year event. And so that really, to me, highlighted both the vulnerability and the challenge and the experience of other countries, to take a look at examples that they went through and made national decisions at the national level to ensure those tragic events that we're experiencing right now don't recur. One of my favorite philosophers, a New York manager, was Yogi Berra, who had, I think, great observations about the future. And one of his best, which I think we can profit from here, was when he was asked why the Yankees happened to have lost a particular series against an opponent. He said, well, we just made too many of the wrong mistakes. And in the case going forward here now, what do we do in the wake of Sandy? We cannot make the wrong mistakes. And Governor Cuomo was widely criticized by certain elements in talk radio yesterday, who even suggested that there might need to be a national investment to protect vulnerable lowlands here, as we made a national decision to protect the lowlands in the city of New Orleans, and roundly criticized for that. Go, Andrew Cuomo, you got Yogi in mind, and I applaud that. Now, my purpose here is to talk just briefly about the international piece. I wanted to say a few words by way of the Sandy introduction, and I don't want to steal any of General Steve Anderson's comments on the domestic and homeland security side. But obviously, as General Cheney has indicated, our definition of what constitutes security, national security, has undergone a great change. This exemplifies that, this illustrates that. But traditionally we viewed national security in the context of old state territorial integrity. Are we protecting our citizens who live in territorial boundaries, the old Westphalian state model, from foreign adversaries or aggressors? But clearly the idea now of security is much more people-centric. We're looking much more at the internal security dynamics in terms of their own well-being, their safety, their own personal safety, the source of food supplies, adequate energy, and shelter. And it's that concept of security which has evolved so dramatically lately, not just domestically, but internationally, that gives this report, I think, such a timely import. On the domestic side, again, not stealing from Steve, but the 2 points I just want to emphasize here. Post 9/11, and particularly post Katrina, in my judgment, I think we've got a decent bolstering of the institutions necessary to address tragedies like this. Northern Command created early in the Bush administration, Homeland Security, its department, umbrella direction to FEMA, plussing up of key organizations like our state National Guards and the Corps of Engineers. The issue, in my judgment, is not so much new organizations or institutions. The issue really is the adequate funding of those domestically. If you look at the statements from Coast Guard, for example, the Corps of Engineers, how pressing their needs are for adequate resourcing, not only for emergency responders, let's say in the Coast Guard case, as we saw here just over the last week, but also in the case of the Corps of Engineers, to make sure that American infrastructure on the water side is adequately resourced. When we protected to the 100-year level in New Orleans, all of the money that went to that was a plus-up for New Orleans alone. It didn't address the region and the area as a system. Barrier Island restoration, lower Mississippi Valley investments, and so on. And the same will happen here in the case of New York, when and if this decision is made to invest and protect the New York Harbor area. That's not going to be done on the basis of Battery Park alone. It's got to be done on a regional basis with Long Island, with the state of New Jersey, the way New Orleans needs to be and the way other low-lying, vulnerable areas need to be as well. And then second, the idea that the resourcing of this needs to be regionally based makes this, in so many respects, a true national effort. As much as Governor Cuomo would argue, Governor Christie would argue, downstream for investments here, we've got to look at this from a national perspective, and that requires leadership at the top. But finally, on the international side, the report, which I think many of you have hopefully at least scanned, has made the point about the new definition of security, which I've previewed here already, but it also makes the point that Gary Hart, Senator Gary Hart, I think, wonderfully highlighted when he began to push us early as the ASP was formed in this particular direction. And that's to stress that national security not only has been redefined in terms of what it means for individual sense of security, but it's increasingly viewed as international security because it crosses the issue of climate change, crosses national borders. It involves not just regions of one country, but major regions of the world. And as you look at the dynamics of global population growth, 1.5 billion more people by 2025, the emphasis that places on ensuring adequate resourcing, water in particular, and shelter for that additional 1.5 billion in the areas of the world that are especially vulnerable, highlight how critical it is that climate change be addressed as the true global security challenge that it is. 2 points on the international side. One, as the report highlights, there are 2 regions of the world especially that are of almost disproportionate impact when the challenge of climate change is seen. That is Africa and the large Asia area, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the East Asian Pacific littoral. Those 2 areas are absolutely crucial as one looks from a global security standpoint in terms of trying to ensure adequate addressal of the climate change challenge from an international security perspective. For the U.S., for our U.S. military, that means especially training in areas like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. It means engagement in the foreign militaries of these countries that border on or are part of those continents. And with respect to our combatant commands, AFRICOM and Pacific Command, it places special highlight on the commanders, on the combatant commanders' ability to look strategically in that region, look at global trends, and make sure that the force functions, the training, and the doctrine that each of those combatant commanders are addressing is adequate to deal with this security challenge. The illustration I would make in the Pacific, for example, almost all the attention has been placed in the Pacific region on the pivot or the rebalancing of U.S. strategic interest in that region and this possible use of what we call air-sea battle. Well, I would argue that even more important than the military battle function of how we're going to possibly engage future adversaries in that region is how the combatant commanders in Africa and the Asia-Pacific region address this particular challenge. And that's ensuring the adequacy, again, of training and engagement with foreign militaries. The second point in this is we can't do this by ourselves. Indeed, we probably can't even be in the lead here except to illustrate domestically, by our own domestic policies, how adaptation to climate change should be done. The key is to make sure in each of these regions that we operate with regional organizations. In Africa, ECOWAS, the the Economic Community of West African States, in South Asia, SAARC, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Collective Security Organization under, on the military side, the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Force. Each of these areas, each of these organizations provide a way in which regions of the world can increasingly adapt to the challenge of climate change without the U.S. being viewed as the option of first resort, as the default. And our leadership in this area to ensure that regional organizations of the type I've described do in fact take the lead on this is one of the strongest priorities, one of the highest priorities, it seems to me, for our diplomatic corps and for our military, to urge, cajole, and if necessary, to help when needed to get these regional organizations to understand the importance that climate change represents for the security of their own people in the regions that are so badly affected. So let me stop there. I hope that's been helpful as a prelude on the international side. I'll turn this now over to General Steve Anderson.
Well, thank you very much, sir, for those comments, and thank you to Steve and to ASP for inviting me to be here. I'm really honored, privileged to be a part of this, to be associated with this great organization and this great effort. And I, as General Christman does, I certainly commend everybody to review this report very closely, because it's really a brilliant report, I believe, and it really hits the mark in all the right places. And again, I'm proud to be part of it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact here at home, homeland security, and why climate change makes us less secure here at home. It's detailed very well in this report, but a couple points I wanted to make in this regard. First, there are some profound operational impacts on our soldiers that are as a result of climate change. I was a former senior logistics officer in Iraq, worked for General Petraeus, 2006 and 2007. And ladies and gentlemen, you won't believe the incredible logistics tale, the footprint and the requirements and the resources are associated with supporting military operations. And right now we're seeing, as a result of this hurricane, tens of thousands of National Guard and reservists and active duty troops being deployed to help mitigate the effects of this terrible storm. Think of all the resources, the money, the water, the fuel, the electrical requirements, all these resources that soldiers are providing right now, which are all necessary, of course. But of course, they also detract them from what they're really supposed to be doing, which is, of course, preparing to fight and defend our nation's wars. So there's a tremendous operational impact associated with climate change here at home in trying to ensure that we do the right thing to support the populace and keep ourselves safe. The transportation assets, the aviation, think about all the capabilities the military has to produce water, electrical power, provide fuel, food for people that need it. I mean, these are necessary things that have to happen. But again, there's a cost associated with that, and one of them is an operational impact on our soldiers. The second point I want to make is there's a real physical impact that's going to be associated with climate change. Think about all the military bases that we have worldwide. I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but it's well over half are in littoral areas, areas that are impacted by rising tides. And I mean, just go around the world, around the map, and just think about all the places we are. Virtually every naval base, of course, is going to be a low-lying littoral area. But also very, very many Air Force and military and Army installations, Marine installations, of course, are going to be impacted. In particular, I'd like to point out Diego Garcia. Many people probably have never even heard of Diego Garcia. But it's essentially an atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it's an incredibly important logistics hub for our forces. And it only sits something like 10 or 15 feet above sea level. I mean, we could lose that facility. Then you look at Bahrain, which is essentially at sea level, a key logistics and naval facility in the middle of the Persian Gulf. That would be directly impacted by rising tides. Then let's look at places like Hawaii, where we've got Pearl Harbor and Air Force and Army facilities that could be very well impacted by rising tides. And indeed, you know, many soldiers can find their places, many soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines can come to work one day and find their facilities underwater. Look at the west coast of the United States, the east coast. I mean, we can work our way around the world. Guam, another place we're moving 9,000 Marines to from Okinawa. These are all places that could have a tremendous physical impact by climate change. And I'm just talking about rising tides. I mean, we can throw in all the other issues that can be associated with droughts and rising temperatures and other environmental impacts that are going to have an impact on our soldiers. So there's a tremendous physical impact on our military facilities. And again, I think it's very well detailed in this report. The third and the final point I'd want to make is regards to, what can we do about it? Okay, what can DOD do about it? Well, I look at the Department of Defense as a tremendous asset, of course, for our nation, not just for security, but also to lead change. And I'm calling upon the Department of Defense to do that in this regard. And a lot of great work has been done by the Department of Defense to address the ills of climate change, but we need to do more. We need to take action. And when you look at what our nation's military has done to lead change in places like race relations, in technological development, the internet, GPS, etc., think about the power of our Department of Defense to lead change in regards to addressing the ills of climate change. Think about what our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines could be doing to leverage renewable energy technologies, for instance. Even places like Afghanistan, a place that I get to still once a quarter due to business opportunities I have over there. But I can tell you right now, nothing's happened or nothing's changed in 12 years to really reduce our incredible dependency on fuel over there. Wouldn't it be nice? I'm not saying soldiers are going to be driving Priuses, okay? But I am saying that there's incredible things that DOD could do. So I'm asking for DOD to reach out. I mean, if you think about what our nation can do if we focus on this problem, I point out that 43 years ago we put a man on the moon. No one's come close since. I mean, if our nation can't focus on this problem of dealing with climate change and reducing our dependencies on carbon-based fuel, I'm absolutely convinced the intellectual power and the capability and entrepreneurial spirit of our nation can beat this problem. And the first part of that problem is to address it, to address the issue of climate change, recognize that it is an issue, and that is a national strategic and operational objective to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Steve, thanks for your comments. Let me turn this over to Andrew Holland, who's co-author of the report.
Steve, thanks, and thanks very much to General Christman and General Anderson. Really great remarks, and I'm just going to quickly detail a couple of things on the report, and then we can open it up to Q&A. And it looks like we've got a good group of people who are working on this issue here, so hopefully we can have a good discussion. You know, I'm asked a lot, why now? Why are you releasing this report now? Why did you decide to write this report? You know, the literature of climate change and security is not a new one. We've talked about this since 2006. CNA was probably one of the first ones to put it out. ASP itself put out the Climate Security Index in 2009. So why now? Why come out with a report in 2012? How is this different? And I think those reports were in many ways foresighted, looking forward, looking towards what could happen and what the potential effects are. Now, I think we've got 5-6 years of experience, and we're seeing these effects. You know, the point is that this sort of stuff is happening now. Things that we were predicting, things that scientists were predicting 5-6 years ago, in many ways are worse, faster. Things like Arctic sea ice melt, things like droughts. You know, I wrote a lot of my remarks for this over a week ago. So even if we don't talk about Hurricane Sandy, to the extreme events of 2012, do provide a glimpse of what we can look at for future events. Domestically in the United States, it was the warmest year on record so far. We've seen killer heat waves, literally killer heat waves, uncontrollable fires. We saw the derecho here in the mid-Atlantic. We saw a drought that affected 61% of the country. You know, these are directly linked. And for a long time, we've been able to say, you know, oh, I don't know if this event is because of climate change or not, but this is what you can expect of it. We can still say that, but now scientists are beginning to more formally link that these events that we're seeing are because of man-made climate change. The Hansen report from this summer really shows that, and I can tell you now that in probably 2 years, the scientists are going to come and say Sandy's track and size were largely because of man-made climate change. You know, that weird left turn it took into the New York, New Jersey coast is really unprecedented in hurricanes. So I can tell you that that's largely going to be blamed on man-made climate change, blamed on the lack of Arctic ice. You know, weather systems, the climate is a difficult and complicated systems, but you know, we can go back and look at these fingerprints. So, you know, that's kind of the reason that we did it. And I wanted to give you a couple more concrete examples. You know, first, and this is around the world. You know, first, we often talk about Bangladesh as the ground zero of the climate security threat. It's a low-lying delta state, much of it heavily populated, already at risk of inundation. Just a 45-centimeter sea level rise would result in the loss of about 11% of the country's landmass and home to about 5.5 million people. That's a lot of people. So where will they go? Many of them go to the cities, the capital city, Dhaka, but many others will try to cross the border with India. And it's already a highly militarized border, already a border that they put a fence along it. And this migration is already happening, going into India's northeastern state of Assam. And just over this past summer, there were major sectarian strife in Assam between immigrant Bangladeshis and the local Indian people. Over 100 people died. 400,000 people were forced to flee their homes into refugee camps between the Muslim immigrants from Bangladesh and the local Hindu and Christian people in Assam. Now, can you blame these deaths on climate change? I don't think you can say that people migrated for any one reason, but can you say, does it help create the conditions for conflict? I think there's a clear case to be made that, you know, this is, as we say in the report, an accelerant of instability. This is something that accelerates already existing conditions. And the second example, and we kind of go into this in the report, is the ongoing civil war in Syria. You know, the 5 years prior to the Arab Spring in early 2011 saw the longest and deepest drought in Syrian history. It was really unprecedented in the last century. You know, before that, the droughts were maybe a year long. This was 5 years long. Really, over 1.5 million people moved from the countryside into the cities. Drought severity was really compounded by the Assad regime's failure to implement smart agriculture practices, smart water practices. Agriculture really wasn't a priority because it gets into sectarian divisions and regional divisions. And you know, I think you can say that these people, these extra people being in the cities, this instability over food production, food prices, contributed to the conflict. It created the underlying conditions that made conflict more likely. Now again, can you say that the Arab Spring happened because of climate change? Probably not, but you can say that it created the conditions for it to be worse in Syria, for example, than in a place like Egypt, which didn't have a drought like this. So, it contributes, it's an accelerant of instability or conflict. And then, just to move quickly from international to domestic, I think one of the things that's new about our report is that it does link it to homeland security. We spend a lot of time in the United States talking about homeland security. We created this whole new department 10 years ago, and we have to move beyond thinking security in homeland security is just for terrorists. It's about the full broad range of human security and homeland security, and thanks to General Christman for underlining that. This is, as our chairman of the board, Gary Hart, says, it is about security of people, security of Americans in this case, and we have Homeland Security has a duty to protect that, not just from extremists and terrorists, but also from the unnamed assailants of climate change, weather, extreme weather, droughts, all that sort of stuff. So with that, give it back to Steve.
Andrew, great comments. General Christman, General Anderson, appreciate both your comments as well. I hope you've had a chance to at least preview the report. I think you understand what it's about here coming from this panel. I can open up to questions here. If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. If you please state any affiliation you might have and keep your question relatively short. Maybe we can have a good dialogue going. Can I have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good morning. Laura Delgado Lopez. I'm with the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. And I have a question. You talk about a broader definition of security and its impacts due to climate change. Can you talk a little bit about what solutions go beyond what the DoD can do, or maybe what kind of partnerships DoD can have with other government agencies in addressing
Andrew, you
consequences?
want to take that one?
Sure, I can start, and if anybody else wants to jump in. You're right. We are a security-oriented institution, so we do tend to talk about the Department of Defense a lot. But it is about working with the whole of government. Addressing climate change, it must be a whole of government solution. This isn't just the military is going to solve everything. The military is the only one who can deal with it. The inbuilt institutional advantages of the Department of Defense are the ability to plan for the long term, the ability to have logistics capability to go anywhere in the country and anywhere around the world in a short amount of time is unique to the Department of Defense and provides unique capabilities. But it does also have to be a whole of government response, and there should be partnerships with the rest of government, but also with private sector and with non-governmental organizations.
General Christman, Anderson, you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, I'll just make some accentuated comments there. I mean, the Department of Defense is the largest consumer of energy in the United States, but it's only 1%. It's the largest government consumer, but it's only 1%. But as Andrew pointed out, DoD tends to get a lot of focus because they can do things to address this issue. And as I mentioned in my comments here, the first thing they can do is recognize that it's a problem. And in fact, DoD, I think, has done that. They have come up online and saying that climate change is real and needs to be addressed. But I encourage them to follow up with action. And the Department of Defense can institute policies that can change the way our soldiers consume fuel and consume energy and address the ills of climate change. What are some of those policies that we might envision? Well, first of all, requiring our soldiers to actually think about fuel consumption when we conduct military operations. Although it might seem to you to be counterintuitive, our operational commanders in theater right now aren't accountable or responsible for a single drop of fuel that they consume. It's provided by the Department of the Defense Logistics Agency, shows up for free, and we don't have policies at the senior DoD DoD levels. We require them to track it like they should. The other issue is that we don't make it a consideration when we evaluate new equipment, a key performance parameter in the parlance of the acquisition community. It's not a factor, and it should be. And so things like this, the Department of Defense can do, policies they can enact, they can make us really address the energy that we consume and the way that soldiers, have to sustain themselves. Do you realize that over 1,000 Americans have died moving fuel in Iraq and Afghanistan? Most people don't realize that. Do you realize that we're spending, our taxpayers will spend $20 billion this year to provide fuel for our troops in Afghanistan? $20 billion. That's in consideration of the fully burdened cost of fuel, what it takes to get fuel up there. So, again, climate change is real. DoD needs to address it, and DoD needs to establish policies that can help us take on this problem of climate change.
And internationally as well, your comment on the partnership, I think, is spot on. There are enormous opportunities to engage with other major partners and powers of the world to help in response to the issues. With NATO and the EU, that frankly couldn't be better. We have a lot more to do, though, for example, with the People's Republic of China, with the PLA Navy. And interestingly, right now, as we speak, there's a humanitarian assistance disaster relief exercise going on in Brisbane that involves the PLA Navy, New Zealand, and Australia. An extraordinary opportunity to engage a key actor, the People's Republic, in a part of the world where vulnerability is very high, as Steve outlined, that provides the kind of outreach and future partnerships that arguably DoD might be able to help lead, but which needs to be sustained on the civilian side by other governmental agencies and NGOs as well, but can be spurred by exercises of the type going on right now in Brisbane.
One of the sad things about climate change is anytime you mention it, people instantly go back to Al Gore and his movie and Greenpeace, and such a left-wing issue, and it's so sad because it's been politicized so much. And that's part of why ASP was founded, that we want to approach it from a factual perspective, and this report lends to that, of course, as have all our previous reports. It's real, it's here, we need to do something about it. It goes across the spectrum. It's just not DoD, it's DOE, it's other things. ASP covers a number of topics. In addition to climate change, we do energy security. It relates to that, it relates to pollution, what contributes to climate change. If you read all the reports, you'll see what we have in there. So it's a great question. I mean, it's far more than just DoD. It's across our whole spectrum, and as General Christman said, it's international as well. Thanks for that question. Yes, ma'am, all the way in the back.
Yes, Annie Snyder with Greenwire. Another topic that is being discussed in Washington right now is cybersecurity. Cyber threat, a lot of people talk about some of the same facilities that we worry about climate change being hit in a cyber attack. I'm curious how you see those two issues complementing or interacting with each other.
That's a great question. Right now, ASP is not covering cyber, although we've been asked to do that, and we will probably get into cyber, but I'm not sure the connection right now between cyber and climate change, unless any of our panel members have some suggestion there.
No, I think that one connection might well be in a broader strategic sense. Maybe 5 years ago, cyber and climate were both viewed as non-traditional threats to security. Over the horizon, concerned about it, growing, but how do we react and adapt and respond? And now, I think everybody recognizes that both of those issues, cyber, climate change, and others as well, other issues as well, have now transformed the debate about what constitutes a security matrix and how we adapt and respond to that. But I'm not sure.
General Christman, that's a great comment, because now we have Cyber Command. And
yeah.
Look at the Pentagon's security. We don't have Climate Command.
Yeah.
Although maybe not a bad idea. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things I'm wondering is if you've thought through what the implications, if we've got Hurricane Sandy, what if a cyber attack came at the same time?
It would be devastating, more devastating than it already is, frankly.
The only analogy I would make is try to link the two, is that I'm calling on DoD to lead our effort in regards to addressing climate change. And obviously cybersecurity would be a similar issue in which DoD, by virtue of the capabilities and the resources that they have, can lead our nation's response, obviously, to cybersecurity. And in every way, in the same way, we can lead our nation's response in regards to addressing climate change.
And I would just say, quickly add as well, in the report we talk about energy infrastructure and the vulnerability of energy infrastructure to climate, and the need for redundancy and resilience in our infrastructure. And I think that redundancy and resilience creates an ability to respond to anything. It's not just responding to a hurricane, it's responding to a cyber attack, it's responding to, just a growth in demand. It's creating a redundant and resilient energy system, which frankly we don't have right now. It should be a priority, and that means everything from transmission lines to more modern generating equipment to equipment that doesn't have to be shut down when a hurricane comes in. So,
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your comments. The Defense Department has
And
made...
you are?
Oh, I'm sorry. Doug Norton. I work for D&S Management Partners. The Defense Department has taken the lead in this area in a number of very significant areas going way back to the Bush administration in 2007. And in some cases, naval commanders are being monitored for the way in which they consume fuel in their maneuvers and so forth. The last time we really tried to grapple with this as a society, though, was 2009 when we went into a cap-and-trade debate. The consequence of which was it became politicized, and the public opinion now is majority folks do not believe that there is a significant threat from climate change. My question is, how does the Defense Department move forward in an environment in which the Congress, for example, is specifically giving them instructions to cease and desist on things which would improve our position with regard to climate change? I'm thinking of the NDAA and the refusal to allow the Defense Department to move forward on alternative fuels. What does the Defense Department do to lead change to help the country move forward to the next stage?
Before I turn over to the panelists, one of the purposes of ASP, we are an educational institution, and I would think after the events of the weekend and now our released report that the public's going to recognize that climate change is a threat. And I hear your comments, and I think that the general public does not regard climate change as a threat, but they might be more inclined to do so today, and we hope more in the future with reports such as this. The rest of the question, General?
I'll just start out with first a great question. And absolutely spot on target. It is to me really sad to see that what has happened in the NDAA and the overt attempts to snuff out the development of the Navy's green fuels program, biofuel development. I think it's the only way you can combat that is education and awareness, like we just heard from Steve. I mean, you just got to make people aware. Make the argument, for instance, in regards to developing biofuels, that of course it's going to be more expensive than conventional fuel. Everything is when you're in a development stage. Look at the costs of microchips, 40 years ago, and now, and what they used to be and what they are now. Our nation, and I commend Secretary Ray Mavis for his incredible leadership in this regard, trying to drive the Navy with some stretched goals to address our dependence on fuel and try to work to develop these biofuels technology. But I guess, like I said, I think the only way you can do that is just education and awareness. Coming up on the net with our leaders in Congress to combat the issue and realize the consequences that are associated with the actions that are being, essentially being delayed or stymied, and to do something about it.
Yeah, I was going to say that the same thing on that last point, on that excellent question. The credibility of the service chiefs, the service secretaries, the combatant commanders, the garrison and post commanders whose communities have been threatened and will be threatened increasingly by the trends that are outlined in the report are the best sources, it seems to me, for the education that Steve is talking about. And let's be candid, all of us have testified before Congress in our careers, talked to the staffers, on the key committees. It is part of an education and advocacy outreach by each of the services and by DOD to make the points, if necessary, from a local community standpoint, from the Norfolk base, from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, to classic low-lying areas that are increasingly threatened by the phenomenon that we talked about here, and making those points quietly and professionally to those in Congress that write rules like this.
ASP has long been a proponent of alternative energies from a wide spectrum. That's in Andrew's portfolio here, and we're a big proponent of biofuels, of course. But one of the problems with biofuels, Secretary Mavis stood up and called it the green fleet, RIMPAC in that business, and then it got into the Greenpeace type thing. I think it would have been better to call it America's fleet, because it's fuel that's grown and made here in America. Same thing with alternative fuel sources or energy sources, whether it be fusion energy or other sources of energy that are less polluting, that are better for us. We are for all of those sources, so it's not an easy question to answer, but that's a great question. Brian?
Yeah, Brian Beaver, citizen. One of the real problems that we have is that a large fraction of the public may accept climate change, but says, well, but humans don't do it. And what's the probability that humans do it? Now, it seems to me that maybe insights from the military side, because the military, it seems to me, always deals with possibilities and probabilities and the consequences of failing to act based upon that possibility. And so I wonder if you have insights into the issue of, well, suppose it's a 50% chance that it's human caused, something like that. Then should we not act on the basis of that probability, because failing to act puts us at great risk? And so I wonder, in terms of the way the people in the DOD, the Pentagon, think about possibilities. I mean, you think about potential adversaries, and we spend a lot of money to prepare ourselves against potential adversaries, even though those people may constitute no threat to us now. But it's your job to protect us against that. Well, is there an analogy there in terms of, well, what's the possibility that people do cause it, and if so, how do we deal with reacting to that possibility and the failure? If we have a failure to act in response to that possibility, do we not put ourselves at risk? I don't think I've phrased it well.
No, I understand that. I'll just take a stab. To be candid, if we were to get into that debate, if the Defense Department were, is it 80% human cause, is it 20% human cause, I think we would quickly find ourselves behind the political 8-ball there and be pushed into oblivion. I think what the Defense Department needs to do is make the hard case based on facts on the ground as we see them, whether that's the result of deforestation or the tundra turning over or some other natural phenomenon. I really would fear if we were to get into that, we'd lose whatever advantages we've already had in terms of trying to move forward in this new environment. And find the phenomenon that you outlined in your excellent question even worse, because then we'd be part of this debate and not viewed as part of a solution.
But you could make a case to say that a potential adversary, we spend a lot of money on a fleet in position and so forth,
Yeah.
against this possibility.
No, I know.
And you have the ability to lead the country to spend that money,
Yeah.
and the Congress to spend that money. Well, here we have an adversary that's not for sure. And how do we use your insights on how to move the Congress this way?
But it's not our job to determine the cost. It's our job, DOD's job, to respond to the result, to recognize that it's real. And, if we got into what drove it, I mean, I agree with you. Humans obviously, do it. But if we get into that, it becomes highly politicized. What DOD needs to do, though, is to vet, it's their job to respond to the eventualities caused by climate change, and to do the what-if scenarios and prepare for those, potential, those potential outcomes. That's our job, not to determine the cost.
But we don't want to just be able to have a war, we'd like to be able to prevent a war.
Agree.
And I would just add that people ask again, why did ASB write this report? part of it is about raising awareness, and part of it is about, just bringing climate change back onto the agenda, something that people talk about. We're not here to advocate for Congress to do something. We're not here to advocate for a specific policy or anything like that. What we're talking about is, just get people to have a debate and debate solutions. And I think that's the role that ASP can play, and frankly, the Department of Defense can play. Because you see these facts on the ground. You see these things that are happening. You don't have to debate whether this will happen sometime in the future. You can say we have a drought affecting 60% of the country right now. We have a hurricane that turned left for some unknown reason that's never hit the Jersey Shore before. We see these effects happening. Department of Defense has to prepare for them. The government has to prepare for these eventualities around the world. Frankly, a lot of the warming, when you talk to the scientists, the next 30 years are pretty much already baked in the cake. So you have when Congress talks cap and trade, that's to deal with climate change in 2040, 2050, and beyond. The climate change that's already coming in is from emissions from the 1970s, 1980s, even back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 1850s. It still stays up there. So, we have to deal with the consequences. And the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, all of these people have to deal with the consequences. We'll let Congress debate solutions for the future. But ASP is going to continue to just talk about facts.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for General Anderson.
And your name, please?
I'm Lindsay Mulgraves. I'm from the European Parliament Liaison Office. You mentioned the tremendous military resources deployed in light of Hurricane Sandy, and that what they should be doing was defending our country, but aren't they defending the individual and human security that General Christman mentioned? And is the military evolving with the changing nature of the security threat from traditional nation-state security with a face to more ambiguous threats like climate change that affect individual and human security?
Yeah, I certainly don't mean to imply that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is exactly that's what I said. But there are some impacts in regards to addressing resources, monies and precious commodities such as fuel and water and food and things like that could potentially impact our nation's military and how they train to do, execute warfare. Their soldiers are being pulled out of schools, there are training missions that aren't happening and whatnot as a result of responding to this threat, which is, of course, the right thing to do. They've got to respond to this threat. Of course, that's what they're there for. The National Guard is there to help respond to that. But my point is that, if we get these things happen with increasing frequency, as I believe they will, we're going to spend more and more time doing those kind of missions and less times thinking about the global threats that are out there and the reason why we have an Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines in the first place, to protect our nation and keep us secure. That's the point of that.
The reverse of that is also true, and that is in 05, 06, 07, when the National Guard in particular was deployed robustly, multiple tours, with the very occupational specialties that are so crucial in disaster relief, military police, combat engineers, and medics. There is that sort of reverse synergy that the units, precisely those needed post-Katrina, and now thank goodness not post-Sandy, but post-Katrina, those units were not there. The National Guard in the southeast portion of the U.S. were deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the Army, thank goodness, didn't have to do it, but we're looking at Fort Bragg for active duty forces, those brigade combat teams that had just returned from those operations overseas to go to Katrina. So that there is a tremendous pressure. That's why I talked about resource adequacy here initially. There's tremendous pressure on precisely those National Guard first responder units that will help in disaster relief when and if there's an overseas contingency. And then the reverse argument is what Steve said. If there is a repetition of the Katrinas and Sandys going forward, if there is an overseas problem, then those folks that we need so desperately to augment the active component are similarly preempted because of the natural requirement to have them save our citizens from the disaster. And it's hard to overstate, if you've not been close to the National Guard and Reserve community, what they went through in the period of the last 10 years when, for complicated reasons, the Defense Department said we're not going to increase the size of our active component until Secretary Gates came in office. We're going to instead view the augmentation of the active component by the Guard and Reserve as a way to handle our forces overseas. And so you had, I happen to have a home in North Carolina, you had North Carolina National Guard military police that were doing 3 or 4 tours in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, and you can imagine the health of that force when they return. They're still rebuilding those units right now that would be the kind of responders that we need if, pray it doesn't happen, but it will. A major blow hits the Southeast, and those units are needed to respond.
And that's a great point. I just want to touch on again. Our resources are finite, okay? If you're doing, responding to a climate event, let's say overseas, as General Christman said. In this case, of course, we were in Iraq and Afghanistan for other reasons. But let's say we are responding to a climate event. Our National Guard and reserves and our active duty are deployed overseas. Now they're not available in the communities like New Jersey and New York and Long Island to respond to, if something happens domestically. And so it works both ways. The resources are finite: time, money, equipment, personnel, etc. There's only so much you have. How are you going to, when you're doing one mission, you're not doing another. That's the point.
Great questions, great answers. Yes, sir.
I'm a journalist from Hungary, and it's a kind of general question, like to what extent do you think the global financial crisis has affected or set back the fight against climate change? I mean, I'm coming from Europe, and where this new problem, the Euro crisis, pushed down the agenda quite a lot.
Global financial crisis and impact on climate change. I'm going to take a shot at that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are two quick thoughts. As Euro finances have been more and more stressed, the investment that would be necessary, let's say, to re-equip and reinvest in energy-saving technologies has been curtailed. I would suggest, perhaps, and you're the better judge on this, in Eastern Europe in particular, where there's a much greater reliance on coal than in Western Europe, where nuclear power, especially in France, has been a byproduct of their energy future for years. Those downstream necessary conversions from high-intensity CO2 emitters to something that's more efficient in that regard probably have been delayed as a result of the crisis. The public financing necessary to do that is arguably much more constrained. And second, just the ability of multinational fora to address this. All of us have had opportunities dealing with fill in the blanks, the WTO, the G20, the UN, regional organizations. Those agendas fill up pretty fast. And as you know, the G20 agenda in particular has been dominated almost exclusively by the collapse in global trade. This is 0809, collapse in global trade, the financial crisis in Europe and the US and elsewhere, to effectively, in my judgment, and I'm stabbing at this, but to preempt any attempt to to try to look at long-term solutions for the climate change issue with respect to CO2 emissions. That's been pushed aside because of the higher priority given to issues like this. The challenge with us, with the US, and I suspect at some point we're going to address the CO2 solution, whatever that may be, the cap and trade thing. I think the political reality downstream will cause that again to come to the fore in one form or another. And when it does, one of the most important elements of that addressal from a US standpoint is that if it's going to sell politically, it cannot be a US alone challenge. What doomed so much of the UN conferences on climate change, what doomed that domestically, politically, is the exemption from Kyoto of the PRC, of the Russian Federation. That cannot occur in any future addressal if we expect the CO2 argument to have any legs politically, domestically.
Let me just add to that for a second that Europe does some things better than we do, and I look at cars and fuel efficiency standards and the CAFE standards, which we just raised here last fall, and you go to pull up to any Europe gas station with the price of gas there. European cars are far more efficient than ours are here. You wonder, why is that? Well, part of the reason is gas is cheaper here, and why it's cheaper here is cheaper because we subsidize it, and we kind of need to get off of fossil fuels, and we're working towards that, and that's a big plank going in ASP. I would also add that in Europe, they're looking far more forward than we are here in terms of energy resources. Look at their support for fusion energy in the heater. They're supporting that. We are not. We are cutting funding here to fusion in the United States when this is the time when we need to be increasing funding toward fusion energy. So that's just another perspective that I would put on that. I can take one more question. Yes, all the way in the back.
Thanks. My name is Jennifer Reichert. I'm with CRDF Global, and I appreciate the conversations you've brought up about partnership, about the international context, and about the ability of DoD to take a leadership role. I'm wondering what DoD is doing, or what DoD could do, to leverage international science partnerships to advance the solutions on the table.
Sure. ASP actually just held an event on the Hill about a month and a half ago, talking about the science for national security and how national security and the science community have worked together historically. The Department of Defense provides a great venue to help develop science, to look 30 years in the future, really the only part of government that has the luxury of being able to plan for 20, 30 years down the road. And that's kind of the time horizon you need to do for science initiatives and moving from basic science to developmental science through the process to something that's useful today. DoD plays a huge role in moving that science forward. We talked about the Green Fleet here some, but that's also, and that is building off of science that was started 20, 30 years ago, and is now becoming near to a commercial scale. Examples like that, examples like the forecasting technology, satellites, weather satellites, things like that are GPS, supercomputers for climate and weather predictions. We could go down the line of lots of individual examples, but I think there's a good case to be made that Department of Defense partnership with science has really helped America's national security for the last 60 years and will continue to.
Let me give you a thought on a very real opportunity that exists for the Department of Defense to work with our NATO partners in addressing the issues of climate change and energy use and whatnot. Afghanistan, we've been there for 12 years, and I've been going back there for 12 years. And virtually nothing has changed in the way that we consume energy over there. As I mentioned before, over 1,000 Americans have died supporting our fuel addiction in Afghanistan. Think about Afghanistan as an operational energy test bed for our nation. And you say, well, what do we want soldiers over there? They're fighting a war, for crying out loud. What do they care about solar panels and geothermal heat pumps and wind turbines and whatnot? Well, think about the guys that are in isolated outposts in the middle of Afghanistan that are essentially dependent upon a lifeblood of fuel that they have to go back to. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a year and a half ago, and I got all kinds of email. One was from a company commander in an isolated outpost in Afghanistan, and he told me, you know, sir, you're absolutely right. We got to do something about our energy use in Afghanistan, and NATO and the United States could work together to do something about this, because I have to stop my combat operations every 2 weeks to spend 2 days to go back and get my fuel. And by the time I come back, the enemy is reset to all the positions they were in 2 weeks prior, and I start all over again. It's like, he says, like Groundhog Day is what the term is. Now think about it. Think if he's out there, instead of having to go back, again, I'm not saying he's going to be driving a Prius, but I am saying they're going to be using, you know, closed cell spray polyurethane foam to insulate their structures. They're going to use solar panels, wind turbines, geothermal heat pumps, etc., hydroelectric opportunities all over Afghanistan. There's things that we could be doing over there to not only develop this operational energy test bed for our military that we can exploit back here in the United States, but also win the war faster. We get trucks off the road. We reduce our vulnerabilities. You know, the likelihood that soldiers survive increases because we're less vulnerable. We win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people that much faster and be able to come home with less of an energy footprint over there. So that's to me, a very real example of an operational energy test bed. And by the way, I didn't come up with this. Tom Friedman wrote about this 5 years ago in The World's Hot, Flat, and Crowded. You know, an operational energy test bed in Afghanistan for our nation.
Okay. General Christman says, another question?
I'm just saying, these are so good. These are so good, they want to help.
So I can tell. Yes, sir, over here. Back here on the left. Ma'am?
Oh, me?
There we go. Sorry.
Miriam Pemberton, Institute for Policy Studies. Speaking of finite resources, given that addressing climate security requires a whole of government approach, and given our fiscal problems, I wonder what role you see for shifting resources from traditional military instruments toward funding the kind of investment in an energy transition that the country needs, and taking the lead with the rest of the world so that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and keep Diego Garcia from going underwater.
Well, I would say there are two kind of different questions in there. One is responding to climate change, you know, responding to events, responding to crises. And the thing is, if you're going to have to do it, whether you plan for it and pay for it in advance, or whether you take those finite resources from somewhere else. So I would say it's better to plan for it now and budget for it and do that sort of stuff in advance. So, you know, when we talk about climate change, especially in this town, a lot of people start thinking about carbon emissions and that sort of stuff. What we talk about in the report really doesn't go into reducing carbon emissions. Clearly, you know, that's a political result that we would not be against, but that's not the point of this report. The point of this report is that these effects are happening now and need to be addressed. So when you talk about the adaptation side, it has to be addressed some way or another. Somebody's going to pay for it. You know, and it kind of goes back to what we said in the previous report, pay now, pay later. You know, if you're going to end up paying the cost in one way or another, whether it's adaptation and prevention or whether it's response. And the overwhelming result is that, you know, the old penny saved, pound foolish. You know, you're trying to prevention is much cheaper than response. In turn, when you talk about mitigation, you know, leading the energy transition, that sort of stuff, that is a political choice that has to be made. I would say that a lot of the stuff that I've talked to people and looked at, and the European example, is that a lot of these things are actually negative cost. Stuff like removing subsidies, stuff like energy efficiency, especially early gain stuff. It's just getting the political will to do it, and it has a negative cost. You know, when you get further down the line, there is significant costs in some places, but you know, early on, a lot of it is negative costs, just getting over the hump.
Yeah, I think the general question from the DoD standpoint, Marion, as I understand your point, is how can we shift this to a non-DoD actors, either governmental or otherwise. I think both Steve and I, in our experience in the most recent conflicts, have always been awaiting the civilian surge. And we're still waiting for that. All of us understand that on the civilian side for development, you need agriculture, justice, commerce, and obviously the USAID and state folks to augment what the Defense Department is doing. There has been a plus up, but in my judgment, nothing like what's been necessary to look at the challenges of development holistically. And I say development for the second and final point, and that is for emerging countries, developing countries especially, if they're going to take these political choices like Andrew just outlined, that are necessary for long-term addressing of this issue, they've got to be growing. There has to be GDP growth so that the political backbone that's necessary to take actions in the fuel subsidies is a classic case. And the perfect illustration is India. Here you have a country that's made enormous development since the early 1990s in privatizing, removing subsidies, and encouraging inbound FDI. But yet when Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, and his government have made suggestions about removing subsidies on diesel, cooking oil, and gasoline, that's a very, very difficult road to overcome. It's easier because of the development in India's GDP per capita for the last 20 years, but it still represents an enormous challenge where long-term the solution here in India as elsewhere is continued GDP growth to give the politicians the political chutzpah to make the necessary changes that address the climate change challenge, amongst others.
What a great answer.
Can I just go ahead? Let's talk about a partnership that DoD can have and that can tremendously impact this issue is with industry. If you look, you know, people tend to vilify the DoD defense industry sometimes. But I will tell you that if you look at the incredible power and intellectual capability that resides in the Lockheed Martins and the KBRs and the Fluors and the DynCorps and the L3s of this nation, I mean, indeed, it has made our military industrial complex has made our military what it is, the finest in the world. And they have incredible capabilities, incredible scientific and R&D communities. And my point is that DoD can help drive change by establishing policy that makes industry team more closely with the military to solve problems. Let me give you an example. The mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, the MRAP. Maybe many of you have never heard about this vehicle. But it was a vehicle that was essentially saving hundreds of lives right now. It's a large VHOL technology vehicle that was directed by Secretary Gates back in 2007. And he said, DoD, you guys are going to work together with the industry. You got 1 year to put 8,000 of these on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you're going to break all the rules and acquisition, and we're going to put this vehicle into the inventory and into the theater to save lives. And oh, by the way, here's $35 billion. that we're gonna use to do this. But doggone it, it did. It broke all the rules. They had 5 different manufacturers, something we never do. And it has saved hundreds of lives and saved thousands of suffering, of lives wounded. And actually, of course, all the human suffering that's been caused. This is an example of DoD policy that drove industry and the Department of Defense to work together to solve a problem. In this case, protecting soldiers. I'm saying we need similar policy to do the same thing, to work together to address the ills of climate change. We can and we must do it within the community.
Great comments. I want to encourage everybody to go on our website. Climate change is not a subject that ASP is going to let go. It's important to us. We handle several other topics that are pertinent and important, so stay up to date with us. And we put out a daily publication called In Case You Missed It. I recommend you go check that off the website as well. I failed to mention earlier there was a co-author of the report, Catherine Foley. Catherine's one of our fellows. She's in Europe today. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine for a great report, and certainly want to thank General Christman and General Anderson for your participation today. Let's give them a big hand.